Side 6. He would have loved, then and there, to have left for the south, where he could learn the new techniques the old man had told him about. But that was, of course, out of the question. He was, after all, only an apprentice, which was to say, a nobody. Strictly speaking, as Baldini explained to him, this was after he had overcome his initial joy at Grenouille's resurrection, strictly speaking, he was less than a nobody, since a proper apprentice needed to be of faultless, i.e. legitimate, birth, to have relatives of the like standing, and to have a certificate of indenture, all of which he lacked. Should he, Baldini, nevertheless decide one day to help him obtain his journeyman's papers, that would happen only on the basis of Grenouille's uncommon talents, his faultless behaviour from then on, and his, Baldini's, own infinite kindness, which, though it often had worked to his own disadvantage, he would forever be incapable of denying. To be sure, it was a good while before he fulfilled his promised kindness. Just a little under 3 years. During that period, and with Grenouille's help, Baldini realized his high-flying dreams. He built his factory in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, succeeded in his scheme for exclusive perfumes at court, received a royal patent. His fine fragrances were sold as far off as St. Petersburg, as Palermo, as Copenhagen. A musk-impregnated item was much sought after even in Constantinople, where God knows they already had enough scents of their own. Baldini's perfumes could be smelled both in elegant offices in the city of London and at the court of Parma, both in the royal castle at Warsaw and in the little Schloss at the Graf von und zu Lippe-Detmold. Having reconciled himself to living out his old age in bitterest poverty near Messina, Baldini was now at the age of 70 indisputably Europe's greatest perfumer and one of the richest citizens of Paris. Early in 1756, he had in the meantime acquired the adjoining building on the Pont au Change, using it solely as a residence, since the old building was literally stuffed full to the attic with scents and spices. He informed Grenouille that he was now willing to release him, but only on 3 conditions. First, he would not be allowed to produce in the future any of the perfumes now under Baldini's roof, nor sell their formulas to third parties. Second, he must leave Paris and not enter it again for as long as Baldini lived. And third, he was to keep the first 2 conditions absolutely secret. He was to swear to this by all the saints, by the poor soul of his mother, and on his own honour. Grenouille, who neither had any honour nor believed in any saints or in the poor soul of his mother, swore it. He would have sworn to anything. He would have accepted any condition Baldini might propose, because he wanted those silly journeyman's papers that would make it possible for him to live an inconspicuous life, to travel undisturbed, and to find a job. Everything else was unimportant to him. What kind of conditions were those, anyway? Not enter Paris again? What did he need Paris for? He knew it down to its last stinking cranny. He took it with him wherever he went. He had owned Paris for years now. Not produce any of Baldini's top-selling perfumes, not pass on their formulas, as if he could not invent 1,000 others just as good and better as and when he wanted to. But he didn't want to at all. He did not in the least intend to go into competition with Baldini or any other bourgeois perfumer. He was not out to make his fortune with his art. He didn't even want to live from it if he could find another way to make a living. He wanted to empty himself of his innermost being, of nothing less than his innermost being, which he considered more wonderful than anything else the world had to offer. And thus Baldini's conditions were no conditions at all for Grenouille. He set out in spring, early one May morning. Baldini had given him a little rucksack, a second shirt, 2 pairs of stockings, a large sausage, a horse blanket, and 25 francs. That was far more than he was obliged to do, Baldini said, considering that Grenouille had not paid a sol in fees for the profound education he had received. He was obliged to pay 2 francs in severance, nothing more, but he could no more deny his own kindly nature than he could the deep sympathy for Jean-Baptiste that had accumulated in his heart over the years. He wished him good luck in his wanderings, and once more warned him emphatically not to forget his oath. With that he accompanied him to the servants' entrance, where he had once taken him in, and let him go. He did not give him his hand. His sympathy did not reach quite that far. He had never shaken hands with him. He had always avoided so much as touching him, out of some kind of sanctimonious loathing, as if there were some danger that he could be infected or contaminated. He merely said a brief adieu, and Grenouille nodded and ducked away and was gone. The street was empty. Baldini watched him go, shuffling across the bridge to the island, small, bent, bearing his rucksack like a hunchback, looking from the rear like an old man. On the far side, where the street made a dog's leg at the Palais de Parlement, he lost sight of him, and felt extraordinarily relieved. He had never liked the fellow, he could finally admit it now. He had never felt comfortable the whole time he had housed him under his roof and plundered him. He felt much as would a man of spotless character who does some forbidden deed for the first time, who uses underhand tricks when playing a game. True, the risk that people might catch up with him was small, and the prospects for success had been great, but even so, his nervousness and bad conscience were equally great. In fact, not a day had passed in all those years when he had not been haunted by the notion that in some way or other he would have to pay for having got involved with this man. If only it turns out all right. That had been his continual anxious prayer. If only I succeed in reaping the profits of this risky adventure without having to pay the piper. If only I succeed. What I'm doing is not right, but God will wink his eye. I'm sure he will. He has punished me hard enough many times in my life without any cause, so that it would be only just if he would deal graciously with me this time. What wrong have I actually done, if there has been a wrong? At the worst, I am operating somewhat outside guild regulations by exploiting the wonderful gifts of an unskilled worker and passing off his talent as my own. At the worst, I have wandered a bit off the traditional path of guild virtue. At the very worst, I am doing today what I myself have condemned in the past. Is that a crime? Other people cheat their whole life long. I have only fudged a little for a couple of years, and only because by purest chance I was given a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Perhaps it wasn't chance at all, but God himself, who sent this wizard into my house to make up for the days of humiliation by Pélissier and his cohorts. Perhaps divine providence was not directing himself at me at all, but against Pélissier. That's perfectly possible. How else would God have been able to punish Pélissier other than by raising me up? My luck in that case would be the means by which divine justice has achieved its end, and thus I not only ought to accept it, but I must, without shame and without the least regret. Such had often been Baldini's thoughts during those years. Mornings when he would descend the narrow stairway to his shop, evenings when he would climb back up carrying the contents of the cash-box to count the heavy gold and silver coins, and at night when he lay next to the snoring bag of bones that was his wife, unable to sleep for fear of his good fortune. But now such sinister thoughts had come to an end. His uncanny guest was gone and would never return again. Yet the riches remained and were secure far into the future. Baldini laid a hand to his chest and felt, beneath the cloth of his coat, that little book beside his beating heart. 600 formulas were recorded there, more than a whole generation of perfumers would ever be able to implement. If he were to lose everything today, he could, with just this wonderful little book, be a rich man once again within a year. Truly, he could not ask for more. Over the gables of the houses across the way, the morning sun fell golden and warm on his face. Baldini was still looking to the south, down the street in the direction of the Palais de Parlement. It was simply too delightful not to see anything more of Grenouille. As washed over by a sense of gratitude, he decided to make that pilgrimage to Notre Dame today, to cast a gold coin in the alms-box, to light 3 candles, and on his knees to thank his Lord for having heaped such good fortune on him, and having spared him from retribution. But then, that same afternoon, just as he was about to head for the church, something absurd happened. A rumor surfaced that the English had declared war on France. This was of itself hardly disquieting, but since Baldini had planned to send a shipment of perfume to London that very day, He postponed his visit to Notre-Dame and instead went into the city to make inquiries and from there to go out to his factory in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine and cancel the shipment to London for the present. That night in bed, just before falling asleep, he had a brilliant idea. In the light of the hostilities about to break out over the colonies in the New World, he would launch a perfume under the name of Prestige de Québec, a heroic, resinous scent whose success, this much was certain, would more than repay him for the loss of business with England. With this sweet thought in his silly old head, relieved and bedded now on its pillow, beneath which the pressure of the little book of formulas was pleasantly palpable, Maître Baldini fell asleep and awoke no more in this life. For that night a minor catastrophe occurred, which, with appropriate delays, resulted in a royal decree requiring that little by little all the buildings on all the bridges of Paris be torn down. For, with no apparent reason, the west side of the Pont au Change, between the third and fourth piers, collapsed. 2 buildings were hurled into the river, so completely and suddenly that none of their occupants could be rescued. Fortunately, it was a matter of only 2 persons, to wit, Giuseppe Baldini and his wife, Teresa. The servants had gone out, either with or without permission. Chénier, who first returned home in the small hours slightly drunk, or rather intended to return home, since there was no home left, suffered a nervous breakdown. He had sacrificed 30 long years of his life in hopes of being named heir in Baldini's will, for the old man had neither children nor relatives. And now, at one blow, the entire inheritance was gone. Everything. House, business, raw materials, laboratory, Baldini himself. Indeed, even the will, which perhaps might have offered him a chance of becoming owner of the factory. Nothing was found. Not the bodies, not the safe, not the little book with its 600 formulas. Only one thing remained of Giuseppe Baldini, Europe's greatest perfumer. A very motley odour of musk, cinnamon, vinegar, lavender, and 1,000 other things, that for several weeks floated high above the Seine, from Paris to Le Havre. When the house of Giuseppe Baldini collapsed, Grenouille was already on the road to Orléans. He had left the enveloping haze of the city behind him, and with every step he took away from it, the air about him grew clearer, purer, and cleaner. It became thinner as well. Gone was the roiling of hundreds, thousands of changing odours at every pace. Instead, the few odours there were, of the sandy road, meadows, the earth, plants, water, extended across the countryside in long currents, swelling slowly, abating slowly, with hardly an abrupt break. For Grenouille, this simplicity seemed a deliverance. The leisurely odours coaxed his nose. For the first time in his life he did not have to prepare himself to catch the scent of something new, unexpected, hostile, or to lose a pleasant smell with every breath. For the first time he could almost breathe freely, did not constantly have to be on the olfactory lookout. We say almost, for of course nothing ever passed truly freely through Grenouille's nose. Even when there was not the least reason for it, he was always alert to, always wary of everything that came from outside and had to be let inside. His whole life long, even in those few moments when he had experienced some inkling of satisfaction, contentment, and perhaps even happiness, he had preferred exhaling to inhaling. Just as he had begun life not with a hopeful gasp for air, but with a blood-curdling scream. But except for that one proviso, which for him was simply a constitutional limitation, the further Grenouille got from Paris, the better he felt, the more easily he breathed, the lighter his step, until he even managed sporadically to carry himself erect, so that when seen from a distance he looked almost like an ordinary itinerant journeyman, like a perfectly normal human being. Most liberating for him was the fact that other people were so far away. More people lived more densely packed in Paris than in any other city in the world. 600,000-700,000 people lived in Paris. Its streets and squares teemed with them, and the houses were crammed full of them from cellars to attics. There was hardly a corner of Paris that was not paralyzed with people, not a stone, not a patch of earth that did not reek of humans. As he began to withdraw from them, it became clear to Grenouille for the first time that for 18 years their compacted human effluvium had oppressed him like air heavy with an imminent thunderstorm. Until now he had thought that it was the world in general he had wanted to squirm away from, but it was not the world, it was the people in it. You could live, so it seemed, in this world devoid of humanity. On the third day of his journey, he found himself under the influence of the olfactory gravity of Orléans. Long before any visible sign indicated that he was in the vicinity of a city, Grenouille sensed a condensation of human stuff in the air, and, reversing his original plan, decided to avoid Orléans. He did not want to have his newfound respiratory freedom ruined so soon by the sultry climate of humans. He circled the city in a giant arc, came upon the Loire at Châteauneuf, and crossed it at Sully. His sausage lasted that far. He bought himself a new one, and, leaving the river behind, pushed on to the interior. He now avoided not just cities, but villages as well. He was almost intoxicated by air that grew ever more rarefied, ever more devoid of humankind. He would approach a settlement or some isolated farm, only to get new supplies, buying his bread and disappearing again into the woods. After a few weeks, even those few travellers he met on out-of-the-way paths proved too much for him. He could no longer bear the concentrated odour that appeared punctually with farmers out to mow the first hay on the meadows. He nervously skirted every herd of sheep, not because of the sheep, but to get away from the odour of the shepherds. He headed straight across country, and put up with mile-long detours whenever he caught the scent of a troop of riders still several hours distant. Not because, like other itinerant journeymen and vagabonds, he feared being stopped and asked for his papers, and then perhaps pressed into military service. He didn't even know there was a war on, but solely because he was disgusted by the human smell of the horsemen. And so it happened quite naturally, and as the result of no particular decision, that his plan to take the fastest road to Grasse gradually faded. The plan unravelled in freedom, so to speak, as did all his other plans and intentions. Grenouille no longer wanted to go somewhere, but only to go away, away from human beings. Finally, he travelled only by night. During the day he crept into thickets, slept under bushes, in the undergrowth, in the most inaccessible spots, rolled up in a ball like an animal, his earthen-coloured horse blanket pulled over his body and head, his nose wedged in the crook of an elbow, so that not the faintest foreign odour could disturb his dreams. He awoke at sunset, sniffed in all directions, and only when he could smell that the last farmer had left his fields and the most daring wanderer had sought shelter from the descending darkness, only when light and its presumed dangers had swept the countryside clean of people, did Grenouille creep out of hiding and set out again on his journey. He did not need light to see by. Even before, when he was travelling by day, he had often closed his eyes for hours on end and merely followed his nose. The gaudy landscape, the dazzling, abrupt definition of sight, hurt his eyes. He was delighted only by moonlight. Moonlight knew no colours and traced the contours of the terrain only very softly. It covered the land with a dirty grey, strangling life all night long. This world moulded in lead, where nothing moved but the wind that fell sometimes like a shadow over the grey forests, and where nothing lived but the scent of the naked earth, was the only world that he accepted, for it was much like the world of his soul. He headed south, approximately south, for he did not steer by a magnetic compass, but only by the compass of his nose, which sent him skirting every city, every village, every settlement. For weeks he met not a single person, and he might have been able to cradle himself in the soothing belief that he was alone in a world bathed in darkness or the cold light of the moon, had his delicate compass not taught him better. Humans existed by night as well, and there were humans in the most remote regions. They had only pulled back, like rats into their lairs, to sleep. The earth was not cleaned of them, for even in sleep they exuded their odour, which then forced its way out between the cracks of their dwellings and into the open air, poisoning a natural world only apparently left to its own devices. The more Grenouille had become accustomed to purer air, the more sensitive he was to human odour, which suddenly, quite unexpectedly, would come floating by in the night, ghastly as the stench of manure, betraying the presence of some shepherd's hut or charcoal burner's cottage or thieves' den. And then he would flee further, increasingly sensitive to the increasingly infrequent smell of humankind. Thus his nose led him to ever more remote regions of the country, ever further from human beings, driving him on ever more insistently towards the magnetic pole of the greatest possible solitude. That pole, the point of the kingdom most distant from humankind, was located in the Massif Central of the Auvergne, about 5 days' journey south of Clermont, on the peak of a 6,000-foot-high volcano named Plomb du Cantal. The mountain consisted of a giant cone of blue-grey rock and was surrounded by an endless, barren highland studded with a few trees charred by fire and overgrown with grey moss and grey brush, out of which here and there brown boulders jutted up like rotten teeth. Even by light of day the region was so dismal and dreary that the poorest shepherd in this poverty-stricken province would not have driven his animals here. And by night, by the bleaching light of the moon, it was such a God-forsaken wilderness that it seemed not of this world. Even Lebrun, the bandit of the Auvergne, though pursued from all sides, had preferred to fight his way through to the Cévennes and there be captured, drawn and quartered, rather than to hide out on the Plomb du Cantal, where certainly no one would have sought or found him, but where likewise he would certainly have died a solitary, living death that had seemed to him worse still. For miles around the mountain there lived not one human being, nor even a respectable mammal. At best a few bats and a few beetles and adders. No one had scaled the peak for decades. Grenouille reached the mountain one August night in the year 1756. As dawn broke, he was standing on the peak. He did not yet know that his journey was at an end. He thought that this was only a stopping place on the way to ever purer air, and he turned full circle and let his nose move across the vast panorama of the volcanic wilderness. To the east, where the broad high plain of Saint-Flour and the marshes of the Rieu River lay. To the north, to the region from which he had come and where he had wandered for days through pitted limestone mountains. To the west, from where the soft wind of morning brought him nothing but the smells of stone and tough grass. Finally, to the south, where the foothills of the Plomb stretched for miles to the dark gorges of the Truyère. Everywhere, in every direction, humanity lay equally remote from him, and a step in any direction would have meant closer proximity to human beings. The compass spun about. It no longer provided orientation. Grenouille was at his goal. And at the same time he was taken captive. As the sun rose, he was still standing on the same spot, his nose held up to the air. With a desperate effort he tried to get a whiff of the direction from which threatening humanity came, and of the opposite direction to which he could flee still further. He assumed that in whatever direction he turned he ought to detect some latent scrap of human odour. But there was nothing. Here there was only peace, olfactory peace, if it can be put that way. Spread all about, as if softly rustling, lay nothing but the drifting, homogeneous odour of dead stones, of grey lichen, and of withered grasses. Nothing else. Grenouille needed a very long time to believe that he was not smelling. He was not prepared for his good luck. His mistrust fought against his good sense for quite a while. He even used his eyes to aid him as the sun rose, and he scanned the horizon for the least sign of human presence, for the roof of a hut, the smoke of a fire, a fence, a bridge, a herd. He held his hands to his ears and listened for a scythe being whetted, for the bark of a dog or the cry of a child. That whole day he stood fast in the blazing heat on the peak of the Plomb du Cantal and waited in vain for the slightest evidence. Only as the sun set did his mistrust gradually fade before an ever-increasing sense of euphoria. He had escaped the abhorrent taint. He was truly, completely alone. He was the only human being in the world. He erupted with thundering jubilation. like a shipwrecked sailor ecstatically greeting the sight of an inhabited island after weeks of aimless drifting, Grenouille celebrated his arrival at the Mountain of Solitude. He shouted for joy. He cast aside his rucksack, blanket, and walking stick, and stamped his feet on the ground, threw his arms to the sky, danced in circles, roared his own name to the four winds, clenched his fists, shaking them triumphantly at the great, wide country lying below him and at the setting sun. Triumphantly, as if he personally had chased it from the sky. He carried on like a madman until late into the night. He spent the next few days settling in on the mountain, for he had made up his mind that he would not be leaving this blessed region all that soon. First he sniffed around for water, and in a crevasse a little below the top found it running across the rock in a thin film. It was not much, but if he patiently licked at it for an hour, he could quench his daily need for liquids. He also found nourishment in the form of small salamanders and ring snakes. He pinched off their heads, then devoured them whole. He also ate dry lichen and grass and mossberries. Such a diet, although totally unacceptable by bourgeois standards, did not disgust him in the least. In the past weeks and months he had no longer fed himself with food processed by human hands, bread, sausage, cheese, but instead, whenever he felt hungry, had wolfed down anything vaguely edible that had crossed his path. He was anything but a gourmet. He had no use for sensual gratification, unless that gratification consisted of pure, incorporeal odors. He had no use for creature comforts either, and would have been quite content to set up camp on bare stone. But he found something better. Near his watering spot, he discovered a natural tunnel leading back into the mountain by many twists and turns, until after 100 feet or so it came to an end in a rock slide. The back of the tunnel was so narrow that Grenouille's shoulders touched the rock, and so low that he could walk only hunched down. But he could sit, and if he curled up, could even lie down. This completely satisfied his requirements for comfort. For the spot had incalculable advantages. At the end of the tunnel it was pitch-black night even during the day. It was deathly quiet, and the air he breathed was moist, salty, cool. Grenouille could smell at once that no living creature had ever entered the place. As he took possession of it, he was overcome by a sense of something like sacred awe. He carefully spread his horse blanket on the ground as if dressing an altar, and lay down on it. He felt blessedly wonderful. He was lying 150 feet below the earth, inside the loneliest mountain in France, as if in his own grave. Never in his life had he felt so secure, certainly not in his mother's belly. The world could go up in flames out there, but here he would not even notice it. He began to cry softly. He did not know whom to thank for such good fortune. In the days that followed, he went into the open only to lick at his watering spot, quickly to relieve himself of his urine and excrement, and to hunt lizards and snakes. They were easy to bag at night when they retreated under flat stones or into little holes where he could trace them with his nose. He climbed back up to the peak a few more times during the first weeks to sniff out the horizon. But soon that had become more a wearisome habit than a necessity, for he had not once scented the least threat. And so he finally gave up these excursions and concerned himself only with getting back into his crypt as quickly as possible once he had taken care of the most basic chores necessary for simple survival. For here, inside the crypt, was where he truly lived. Which is to say, for well over 20 hours a day in total darkness and in total silence and in total immobility, he sat on his horse blanket at the end of the stony corridor, his back resting on the rock slide, his shoulders wedged between the rocks, and enjoyed himself. We are familiar with people who seek out solitude, penitents, failures, saints, or prophets. They retreat to deserts, preferably, where they live on locusts and honey. Others, however, live in caves or cells on remote islands. Some, more spectacularly, squat in cages mounted high atop poles swaying in the breeze. They do this to be nearer to God. Their solitude is a self-mortification by which they do penance. They act in the belief that they are living a life pleasing to God, or they wait months, years, for their solitude to be broken by some divine message that they hope then speedily to broadcast among mankind. Grenouille's case was nothing of the sort. There was not the least notion of God in his head. He was not doing penance, nor waiting for some supernatural inspiration. He had withdrawn solely for his own personal pleasure, only to be nearer to himself. No longer distracted by anything external, he basked in his own existence and found it splendid. He lay in his stony crypt like his own corpse, hardly breathing, his heart hardly beating, and yet lived as intensively and dissolutely as ever a rake had lived in the world outside. The setting for these debaucheries was, how could it be otherwise, the innermost empire where he had buried the husks of every odour encountered since birth. To enhance the mood, he first conjured up those that were earliest and most remote: the hostile, steaming vapours of Madame Gaillard's bedroom, the bone-dry, leathery bouquet of her hands, the vinegary breath of Father Terrier, the hysterical, hot maternal sweat of Bussy, the wet nurse, the carrion stench of the Cimetière des Innocents, the homicidal odour of his mother. And he wallowed in disgust and loathing, and his hair stood on end at the delicious horror. Sometimes, if this repulsive aperitif did not quite get him into stride, he would allow himself a brief, odoriferous detour to Grimal's for a whiff of the stench of raw, meaty skins and tanning broths, or he imagined the collective effluvium of 600,000 Parisians in the sultry, oppressive heat of late summer. And then, all at once, the pent-up hate would erupt with orgasmic force. That was, after all, the point of the exercise. Like a thunderstorm, he rolled across these odours that had dared offend his patrician nose. He thrashed at them as hail thrashes a grain field. Like a hurricane, he scattered the rabble and drowned them in a grand, purifying deluge of distilled water. And how just was his anger, how great his revenge! Ah! What a sublime moment! Grenouille, the little man, quivered with excitement, his body writhed with voluptuous delight, and arched so high that he slammed his head against the roof of the tunnel, only to sink back slowly and lie there lolling in satiation. It really was too pleasant, this volcanic act that extinguished all obnoxious odours. Really too pleasant. This was almost his favourite routine in the whole repertoire of his innermost universal theatre, for it imparted to him the wonderful sense of righteous exhaustion that comes after only truly grand heroic deeds. Now he could rest a while in good conscience. He stretched out, to the extent that his body fitted within the narrow stony quarters. Deep inside, however, on the cleanly swept mats of his soul, he stretched out comfortably to the fullest and dozed away, letting delicate scents play about his nose. A spicy gust, for instance, as if borne here from springtime meadows. A mild May wind wafting through the first green leaves of beech. A sea breeze with the bitterness of salted almonds. It was late afternoon when he arose. Something like late afternoon, for naturally there was no afternoon, or forenoon, or evening, or morning. There was neither light nor darkness, nor were there spring meadows, nor green beech leaves. There were no real things at all in Grenouille's innermost universe, only the odours of things, which is why the façon de parler speaks of that universe as a landscape, a no more than adequate expression, to be sure, but the only possible one, since our language is of no use when it comes to describing the smellable world. It was then late afternoon. That is a condition and a moment within Grenouille's soul such as reigns over the south when the siesta is done, and the paralysis of midday slowly recedes, and life's urge begins again after such constraint. The heat kindled by rage, the enemy of sublime sense, had fled. The pack of demons was annihilated. The fields within him lay soft and burnished beneath the lascivious peace of his awakening, and they waited for the will of their Lord to come upon them. And Grenouille rose up, as noted, and shook the sleep from his limbs. He stood up, the great innermost Grenouille. Like a giant he planted himself, in all his glory and grandeur, splendid to look upon. Damn shame that no one saw him, and looked about him, proud and majestic. Yes, this was his empire, the incomparable empire of Grenouille. Created and ruled over by him, the incomparable Grenouille, laid waste by him if he so chose, and then raised up again, made boundless by him and defended with a flaming sword against every intruder. Here there was naught but his will, the will of the great, splendid, incomparable Grenouille. And now that the evil stench of the past had been swept away, he desired that his empire be fragrant. And with mighty strides he passed across the fallow fields and sowed fragrance of all kinds, wastefully here, sparingly there, in plantations of endless dimension and in small, intimate parcels, strewing seeds by the fistful or tucking them in one by one in selected spots. To the furthermost regions of his empire, Grenouille the Great, the frantic gardener, hurried, and soon there was not a cranny left into which he had not thrown a seed of fragrance. And when he saw that it was good, and that the whole earth was saturated with his divine Grenouille seeds, then Grenouille the Great let descend a shower of rectified spirit, soft and steady, and everywhere and over all the seeds began to germinate and sprout, bringing forth shoots to gladden his heart. On the plantations it rolled in luxurious waves, and in the hidden gardens the stems stood full with sap. The blossoms all but exploded from their buds. Then Grenouille the Great commanded the rain to stop, and it was so, and he sent the gentle sun of his smile upon the land. Whereupon, to a bud, the hosts of blossoms unfolded their glory from one end of his empire unto the other, creating a single rainbowed carpet woven from myriad precious capsules of fragrance. And Grenouille the Great saw that it was good, very, very good, and he caused the wind of his breath to blow across the land, and the blossoms, thus caressed, spilled over with scent and intermingled their teeming scents into one constantly changing scent that in all its variety was nevertheless merged into the odor of universal homage to him, Grenouille the Great, the incomparable, the magnificent, who, enthroned upon his gold-scented cloud, sniffed his breath back in again, and the sweet savour of the sacrifice was pleasing unto him. And he deigned to bless his creation several times over, from whom came thanksgiving with songs of praise and rejoicing, and yet further outpourings of glorious fragrance. Meanwhile evening was come, and the scents spilled over still and united with the blue of night to form ever more fantastic airs. A veritable gala of scent awaited, with one gigantic burst of fragrant, diamond-studded fireworks. Grenouille the Great, however, had tired a little, and yawned, and spoke. "Behold, I have done a great thing, and I am well pleased. But as with all works once finished, it begins to bore me. I shall withdraw, and to crown this strenuous day, I shall allow myself yet one more delectation in the chambers of my heart." So spoke Grenouille the Great, and while the peasantry of scent danced and celebrated beneath him, he glided with wide-stretched wings down from his golden cloud, across the nocturnal fields of his soul, and home to his heart. Ah, returning home was pleasant. The double role of avenger and creator of worlds was not a little taxing, and then to be celebrated afterwards for hours on end by one's own offspring was not the perfect way to relax either. Weary of the duties of divine creator and official host, Grenouille the Great longed for some small domestic bliss. His heart was a purple castle. It lay in a rock-strewn desert, concealed by dunes, surrounded by a marshy oasis, and set behind stone walls. It could be reached only from the air. It had 1,000 private rooms, and 1,000 underground chambers, and 1,000 elegant salons, among them one with a purple sofa where Grenouille, no longer Grenouille the Great, but only the quite private Grenouille, or simply dear little Jean-Baptiste, would recover from the labours of the day. The castle's private rooms, however, were shelved from floor to ceiling, and on those shelves were all the odours that Grenouille had collected in the course of his life, several million of them. And in the castle's cellars the best scents of his life were stored in casks. When properly aged, they were drawn off into bottles that lay in miles of damp, cool corridors, and were arranged by vintage and estate. There were so many that they could not all be drunk in a single lifetime. Once dear little Jean-Baptiste had finally returned to his chez soi, lying on his simple, cosy sofa in his purple salon, his boots finally pulled off, so to speak. He clapped his hands and called his servants, who were invisible, intangible, inaudible, and above all inodorous, and thus utterly imaginary servants, and ordered them to go to the private rooms and get this or that volume from the great library of odours, and to the cellars to fetch something for him to drink. The imaginary servants hurried off, and Grenouille's stomach cramped in tormented expectation. He suddenly felt like a drunkard who is afraid that the shot of brandy he has ordered at the bar will, for some reason or other, be denied him. What if the cellar or the library were suddenly empty? If the wine in the casks had gone sour? Why were they keeping him waiting? Why did they not come? He needed the stuff now. He needed it desperately. He was addicted. He would die on the spot if he did not get it. Calm yourself, Jean-Baptiste. Calm yourself, my friend. They're coming. They're coming. They're bringing what you crave. The servants are winging their way here with it. They are carrying the book of odours on an invisible tray, and in their white-gloved, invisible hands they are carrying those precious bottles. They set them down, ever so carefully. They bow, and they disappear. And then, left alone at last, once again, left alone, Jean-Baptiste reaches for the odours he craves, opens the first bottle, pours a glass full to the rim, puts it to his lips, and drinks. Drinks the glass of cool scent down in one draught, and it is luscious. It is so refreshingly good that dear Jean-Baptiste's eyes fill with tears of bliss, and he immediately pours himself a second glass. A scent from the year 1752, sniffed up in spring, before sunrise on the Pont Royal, his nose directed to the west, from where a light breeze bore the blended odours of sea and forest, and a touch of the tarry smell of the barges tied up at the bank. It was the scent from the end of his first night spent roaming about Paris without Grimal's permission. It was the fresh odour of the approaching day, of the first daybreak that he had ever known in freedom. That odour had been the pledge of freedom. It had been the pledge of a different life. The odour of that morning was for Grenouille the odour of hope. He guarded it carefully, and he drank of it daily. Once he had emptied the second glass, all his nervousness, all his doubt and insecurity fell away from him, and he was filled with glorious contentment. He pressed his back against the soft cushions of his sofa, opened a book, and began to read from his memoirs. He read about the odours of his childhood, of his school days, about the odours of the broad streets and hidden nooks of the city, about human odours, and a pleasant shudder washed over him, for the odours he now called up were indeed those that he despised, that he had exterminated. With sickened interest, Grenouille read from the book of revolting odours, and when his disgust outweighed his interest, he simply slammed the book shut, laid it aside, and picked up another. All the while he drank without pause from his noble scents. After the bottle of hope, he uncorked one from the year 17